Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for the very last lecture of 2022. I am delighted to welcome and introduce our speaker, Dr. Kenan Sharpe, who is also our ARIT NEH research fellow this academic year. Kenan received his PhD degree in literature from the University of California, Santa Cruz in 2019. With a dissertation entitled Cultural Revolutions, Turkey and United States during the long 1960s, focusing on the poetry and popular music of social movements. His research explores the relationship between the protests and cultural production in Turkey, Greece, and United States during moments of political mobilization. And currently, he's based in Istanbul doing research for his first academic book, which will be named Rockers and Radicals in Anatolia, Turkish Psychedelic Rock and the World in 1960s. In addition to his academic work, Kenan also shares his expertise on the more public platforms. He works as a journalist and he has spent 2 years as an arts and culture columnist at Duvar English. And he is also currently hosting a weekly program called Pop and Politics at Mediascope, featuring interviews with Turkish artists, musicians, actors, writers, and filmmakers. I had the chance to hear Kenan some time ago when he gave a presentation on Turkish music to ARIT Summer Language Fellows. And this evening, I'm very thrilled to have him as our speaker to share his research with the wider ARIT community. So for those of you who are on Zoom, please make sure that your mics are muted. And also at the end of his presentation, Kenan will be accepting questions both from the audience here at Anamed Auditorium and also over Zoom. So without further ado, I would like to pass the mic to Kenan for his talk, Anatolian Rock and the 1960s social movements in Turkey between the countryside and the world. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. And thanks to everyone who's joining on Zoom as well. I really want to thank ARIT, first of all, both for the chance to be a fellow this year and for their support in my research, and also getting to do this and share my work with all of you guys. So thank you so much to Zeynep. Thank you to Nancy in the US office. And so, yeah. As Zeynep just said, I want to talk to you today about Anatolian rock, this really interesting genre of popular music that combined Turkish folk music with global rock and roll. So in the 1960s and the 1970s, you have musicians like Cem Karaca and bands like Moğollar, and they're taking lyrics and melodies from the Anatolian countryside and combining them with modern instruments like, drums, electric guitars, bass, synthesizers, etc. And what I want to share today is a bit from my book and sort of a capsule summary of all the kind of main points I try to hit. I have a tendency to talk about this stuff for far too long, so hopefully I'll keep it within the hour and we'll have time for questions. So if you follow Turkish music, you might have noticed that this genre has been having a kind of interesting revival in recent years. There's been different companies reissuing LPs from people like Barış Manço or Selda Bağcan, etc. So you can find these records sold, from Chicago to Stockholm and beyond. So it's having this kind of moment. But despite this newfound interest in this music from the 60s and 70s, in Turkey, there's yet to be really, book-length academic study on this music, both, its own context and also asking why exactly it's popular today. So that's part of what I want to share with you today. So in the book, I think it's really important, and what I try to do is situate this music in the social movements of Turkey in this period. We're talking about the 60s and 70s, a really intensely politicized period. And I also try to situate the music within global youth counterculture through the 60s. When we think about the hippies, we think about psychedelic rock, all this stuff. Both those contexts are really important. So in talking about this music, I discuss the social dynamics in the 60s that linked Anatolia, the countryside, to the cities, that linked peasants to students, the way that rural music traditions influence youth culture, really interestingly, and the way things like the official ideology of peasantism, köylülük, affected the creation of Anatolian rock. The Cold War becomes a really important part of the story when you think about how American cultural influences travels the world in this period and how and why. So what I wanted to do today is really discuss the historical roots of this music, the musical underpinnings of it, and the political implications. So I'm going to tell you what Anadolu Rock is, but also what I think it means. Really try to interpret what this phenomenon meant in its own context. So weirdly, to begin the story, it's not rock, but jazz that we have to start with. So in 1964, a talented and young jazz singer named Tülay German, she surprised listeners by adding a folk song to her repertoire. So she would normally go up in these beautiful ball gowns and sing Ella Fitzgerald and people like that. She starts singing this song called Burçak Tarlası. Burçak is this ancient Anatolian crop, which has the weird name of bitter vetch in English, but it's really, from this region. So in the song, it's narrated by a peasant woman who is harvesting in the fields, and as she harvests, she rails against the cruelty of the feudal lord who's oppressing her. So what Tülay German and her team did is they took this old türkü, this folk song, they took the lyrics and the melody, updated the instrumentation, and out came this swanky version with electric guitar and piano and saxophone. And before long, other interpretations of Turkish folk songs in this style began to appear, and you start having what we now know as Anadolu Rock. So I want to share little pieces of these songs as we go, and hopefully we won't have too many technical difficulties. I'll just show you the first little bit of this song. I have to go right to the other screen. Yes. Okay, I'm going to stop it there, unfortunately. If you haven't heard the song, it's a really great one. So as you can hear, they took this traditional folk song and have these kind of overtones from Latin music. There's cowbell, a completely different style than it was first, than the original one was. So what happened, what was so important about this song is that it was the first successful example of what music critic Murat Meriç calls the reinterpretation of local melodies with Western instruments. So it would take until 1970 actually for the genre to receive a name. After the long-haired members of the band Moğollar went through a whole tour of Anatolia, they came back and said the music they were doing is Anadolu pop. Of course, in this moment, there isn't a really firm differentiation between rock and pop. And in fact, this kind of music was known more broadly as hafif batı müziği aslında, actually, so light Western music. But over time, as rock becomes to be the preferred term, Anadolu pop, as Tülay German was doing, gets known as Anadolu Rock. So as you can guess, a song like this really polarized audiences. So listeners, like I said, came to these swanky nightclubs where German would perform, expecting to hear songs like Summertime or Stardust. And she comes and she's singing this folk song about, harvesting crops. And people were pretty upset about this at the moment, this music from the countryside, because it was seen as uncouth, unsophisticated, things that peasants listen to and not something the urban elites would like. So as an interesting example of this, Doğan Canku of an important band, Modern Folk Üçlüsü, said, "In our youth, we would poo-poo the bağlama whenever it was mentioned. It was seen as the musical instrument of the low plebeian classes. Same goes for türkü. Let Anatolia listen to that. We listen to Elvis Presley, man." This is the sort of attitude of that moment when it shows you how radical this gesture was to take this music at the time. So we're talking about folk music, right? Being adapted to Western instrumentation and different styles. But when we think about Turkish folk music, we have to ask exactly what we're talking about here. Which folk music? Because as we know, the idea of Turkish folk music, of course, people always made music, but this category of Turkish folk music, of course, is a recent invention. So around the time of the disastrous First Balkan War, different Ottoman thinkers were thinking it through different strategies to, find their national salvation. So there was pan-Islamism, there was this idea of, Ottoman citizenship and these different ideals that you could rally the crumbling empire around. And of course, a dominant one became Turkism. And one of the important sources for this idea of Turkism, of course, was the work of European Orientalists who had done research about the Turks. So after the foundation of the Turkish Republic, the work of French and German ethnographers and folklorists became a really important inspiration for intellectuals in the new empire, trying to support this idea, and folk music became an important part of that. You have Europeans like the Hungarian composer Bela Bartok, invited the Turkey to go to the countryside, collect songs, and his methodological skills that he passed on, and the archive as well, became really important in developing a state official archive of Turkish folk songs. But creating a monolithic folk culture out of the incredible diversity of Anatolia meant discarding anything that didn't fit in with the narrative. So songs weren't added to the state's official catalog of folk songs if they were overly regional in sound, if they were performed in languages other than Turkish, if they contained references to non-mainstream religious beliefs, etc., or else they were sometimes adapted. So the musicologist Martin Stokes gives some really great examples of songs that were mangled and transformed in really weird ways as the state was trying to adapt these songs to the archive. So for example, they changed a folk song to get rid of some loan words. And originally, so when they changed the song, what you have is a character in the folk song getting on a boat in Samsun and landing at Iğdır, which of course is landlocked. You can't take a boat from Samsun to Iğdır, but this is one way they would do these kind of strange adaptations of the songs to make them fit. Another really canonical example is the folk song we all know, Sarı Gelin. But of course, as you probably know, the word that was changed into Turkish as Sarı is actually an Armenian word meaning yellow. Sorry, I said it meaning from the mountains, the bride from the mountains. To say Sarı Gelin, the yellow bride, I think probably to none of us has really made much sense, and that's the reason these things happened. So these songs made it through this process of assimilation, and then they were stored in the state folklore archives. So from 1964 to 1990, TRT, the Turkish Radio and Television Corporation, ruled the airwaves. So if a folk song wasn't in their archives, you couldn't play it on the radio or then on the TV. So this process was really, really important in creating the idea of what folklore or folk music was. So when Anadolu Rock musicians will describe themselves as going back to this kind of pure, unadulterated genius of the people, of course, there's already many processes of sort of selection that are going on in creating that. Okay. Of course, there are other genres that are popular. As we saw, Tula German and others were playing jazz at this moment, different genres of popular music. My slides got confused. We'll just put it here. Jazz was important, canto much earlier, tango, all these other genres that came into first the Ottoman Empire and then the Republic of Turkey. And this helped for the first rock and roll groups to form. So in 1957, you have Barış Manço's Harmoniler releasing their first 45 record in this new genre. Sorry, they formed in 1957, and in 1962, they put out Twisting USA and The Jet. So describing this earlier period, Barış Manço said that he would just sing whatever Elvis Presley sang. There was this, there wasn't yet this process of bringing in Turkish folk music, or they would sing songs in English like Rock Around the Clock or House of the Rising Sun, etc. Another big genre at this time before Anadolu Rock came in was something called arrangement. So they would take songs that were popular, say in France or in Italy especially, and have note for note replications of these songs, but add Turkish lyrics in many cases. So one of the great examples is İlham Gencer's Bak Bir Varmış Bir Yokmuş, which was actually a French song by Babazan, and it got turned into the song about a Bosphorus love story. So I like to think about this arrangement, and the music critic Naim Din Mener says this too, that it's almost a type of import substitution. This is a period where, of course, the strategy for industrialization was to make local products instead of importing them, and therefore sort of firm up local industry. And in a similar way, you have these folk songs being these popular European hits being adapted, and in that way kind of creating a replacement for them. So that's the atmosphere by the time Burçak Tarlası comes out in 1964. And this new bold gesture she did would pave the way for the eventual melding of Turkish rock with Turkish folk. So you might ask how it was that one of Istanbul's young, educated, she studied at the American School in Üsküdar for girls, I believe, came to start doing folk songs in this way. So I think it's interesting to look at her milieu. She credits left-wing jazz innovator Erdem Buri for inspiring her to work with folk music. At a party famously in Moda in the early 60s, Buri asked her why she's singing songs by Ella Fitzgerald. She's Turkish and should be singing songs in Turkish, she argued. So she took this advice to heart and they started this new project together. And in the 45 record of Burçak Tarlası, Erdem Buri left a note describing exactly what they were trying to do. So he says here, those who are working to realize the birth of Turkish popular music are trying to realize it on two fronts. One is to arrange folk songs without at all destroying their melody and rhythmic structure within popular music forms. The other is to write new pieces that attempt to explain Turkish realities. So with what I gave you of the lyrics of Burçak Tarlası, you can see this. You have this, it's really a song about injustice. It's about this woman harvesting in the fields, the feudal lord, the is being cruel to her. It's a really actually interesting and political song. And one thing that's really interesting is the lyrics are actually changed for the recording. So in the original, she says, I hope the Zaptiye, the gendarme go to hell because they conscripted her husband and left her at the mercy of this terrible feudal lord. There's also, she famously says, "Bakın şu adamın kaç tarlası var. Look at how many fields this man has." The original is Deus. So this jerk, whatever you want to say for that insult. So there's a real politics there, and it really is coming out of this context, of course, of the village novels in the 50s, people like Yaşar Kemal and others who were kind of talking about and exposing urban audiences to what's happening in the countryside. This is a period where left-wing sociologists are obsessed with the figure of the You have academics going down to the countryside trying to do research into the so-called feudal remnants of Anatolian society. And this song really fits well with that entire left-wing milieu of this period. And of course, Buri and German both were part of the Workers' Party of Turkey, TİP. And they actually put out their campaign song for the party. Another important factor in this whole sort of environment, here's some images of that period, both of TİP and this milieu around German. Another really important figure in this genre coming into existence is Ruhi Su, who was actually an orphan, probably of Armenian origin from Eastern Turkey, who went on to study opera at the State Conservatory. And he also, passionately hosted a program on Turku and went around the countryside collecting songs. Of course, he was a member of the Turkish Communist Party and was arrested and banned from the airwaves for a long time and started playing in nightclubs around Istanbul where he met Buri and German. So what I'm trying to say is that out of this whole environment of these kind of left-wing intellectuals comes this new idea of adapting Turkish folk songs to Western genres to describe Turkish realities. And it was a really ingenious tactic, actually, because of course, Su was someone who had been arrested, right, for being a communist and for his own activism. But if you take these anonymous folk songs from the countryside and then you readapt them, you're kind of safe in a way, right? You can't say like, why are you critiquing the state? Because it's an anonymous song in many cases from many decades or even longer ago. So it's kind of, plausible deniability. You could say, well, I didn't say this is anonymous folk song from wherever, you know what I mean, when you're giving these critiques. So it was really a smart strategy. But as the genre goes on, more and more these musicians begin to write their own songs. And as I want to show you, well, it gets into really pretty intense territory. We have these explicitly anti-imperialist anthems being written in this kind of mixture of styles of both folk music and rock and roll in really interesting ways as this goes on. Okay, so why am I spending so much time trying to show you the kind of left-wing credentials of this music? So other scholars have asserted that, this Anatolian rock movement wasn't really very political or wasn't really a big part of the politics of the 1960s. So one example is actually from a really great book. You will know Emin Alper now, of course, as a director, but he studied at Boğaziçi and wrote a dissertation, which has now been published as a book. And for those of us who work in the field of the 60s, it's a really important book. And this is what Alper has to say, and he echoes here a lot of people's thoughts on the 60s in Turkey. The cultural manifestations of the libertarian countercultural movements in 1968 was rock music in the Western world. However, in Turkey, rock music was not so important for the student movement, nor were its implications of an alternative culture strong. Although there were left-wing and oppositional singers in the genre of Anatolian rock, its prevailing character was not oppositional, and this music was by no means emblematic for the radical student movement. So I'm, in fact, arguing the opposite. There are a lot of moments of tension between rockers and radicals, but more often than not, they share the same milieu. Not all Anatolian rockers, of course, were leftists. There are people like Ersan, who was closer to the right wing, and the MHP even. Nationalists tended like Barış Manço, even though he himself was a liberal. But overall, you have a very strong left-wing presence in this genre, and really its origins come out of that leftist intellectual milieu. So I think that's important because it helps us understand what came later, and also what I'm trying to say is Anadolu Rock was political, not just when they were anthems to the revolutionary peasants who were going to start the guerrilla war and, you know, take down the state or whatever, but even when it was just kind of fun songs, like in the early days, something like Helvacı, or these kind of really kind of silly early songs, people like Silüetler and Mavi Işıklar. Even then, there is a political substrate to this music. Even if it's not oppositional, there's a nationalist content to it that really fits in with certain aspects of the official ideology, which is something I'm trying to argue. So let me give you some context for this argument. So after Buçak Tarlası blew up and became a really popular and important song, the newspaper Hürriyet decided to host a competition to encourage this new trend in Turkish music. Skip this for now. So from 1965 to 1968, Hürriyet hosted the Golden Microphone Prize competition. It really transformed Turkish music by uniting Turkish folk and global pop into a real movement. So a lot of the bands who became household names later, like Erkin Koray, Fikret Kızılok, Mavi Işıklar, Edip Akbayram even, got their start by joining in this competition where hundreds of these young kids who were all into this music would come. Near Gezi Park, there was a place where you would go to the bottom floor and audition. And then if you joined the competition and you won, they would both press your single, and also there would be a money prize, and you'd be featured in the newspaper, and it'd be a huge way to get publicity. So this was a really important force in popularizing this genre and creating more bands and helping them get exposure. But the thing that's interesting to think about is, why would one of the important Turkish newspapers of this time put this energy into supporting these long-haired, weird young kids who want to, play Turkish folk music with guitar and drum kit or whatever? So this was the explicit statement in the competition describing what the goal was, to give a new direction to Turkish music by taking advantage of the rich techniques and forms of Western music. So I think if you've studied nationalism or different ideologies in the late Ottoman Empire and early Republic, you might have certain alarm bells going off right now when you hear the words, music and technique, because this is, of course, a very old idea. For example, the reforming intellectual Ziya Gökalp thought that the Ottoman Empire needed to take the science and technology that made the West successful, the West, while preserving its own culture. So he had this idea that on the one hand, you have Hars, culture, on the other hand, you have Medeniyet, civilization, which for him included technology. So it's the idea that you could take the technology of the West, because it's universal, while preserving the culture of where you are from, and in this way become a modern society. I think a similar logic is really active here, where you can preserve the culture by using the melodies and lyrics of Turkish folk songs while taking the technology of the West and using, again, the drum kit and the guitar and the synthesizer and whatever else. So there's a kind of national pedigree to this idea that mirrors this idea of culture and civilization. Okay. So I want to go back to the 60s for a second. I think my slides got a bit messed up. Oh, here it is. So this idea, as the music gets more and more radical, has implications for how we understand the global 1960s. So of course, just to sort of refresh our memories, this is a period in which there are protest movements traveling wildfire from one country to another. Everything from May 68 in Paris to the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the Black Panthers in the United States, the German, West German New Left, and then of course music, cinema, and all these different fields. You have all these things happening at the same time. And if I go back just a bit, when we think about Turkey, of course, very similar things happening, from student occupations of campuses to left-wing parties coming into parliament for the first time in this period, anti-imperialist and anti-NATO activism, a really strong anti-Americanism, all sorts of militancy among workers, among peasants, among students, etc. But when we think about the 60s in Turkey, this is the aspect, and in the scholarship, that gets emphasized the most. But of course, one thing I've tried to do, I tried to do in my dissertation and in general with this project as well, is show really how crucial art and culture was to the period. So if you think about all the stuff happening in literature at the time with a radical feminist writer like Sevgi Soysal, for example, all the stuff happening in film with people like Yilmaz Güney, of course, all the stuff in music, the incredible amount of publications, in the midst of this really intense political atmosphere. You have, all this ink being spilled on analyzing literature and talking about what the best aesthetic in poetry is to make a revolutionary poetry. It's this really incredible explosion of creativity. And I think it's really important to see that the things happening in the cultural realm is absolutely connected. So in that way, I don't think that, rock and roll was an oppositional force in Western Europe and the United States or North America and wasn't in Turkey. I think really culture is this important locus of struggle, and the fact that intellectuals spend so much time arguing about culture and what the best kind of forms were to express political ideas really is a sign for us that this is really crucial. So I want to skip ahead to as Anadolu Rock gets more explicitly oppositional. So here I was saying that there's a kind of implicit nationalist content, but it also gets explicitly revolutionary as time goes on. So let me play a bit of another song for you. That's wrong. I have to go up this way. No, I have to close it. This. We're testing my technological knowledge here. For the sake of time, I should stop it there, but a really incredible song for those who know it. Okay, here's a translation of the lyrics. Let me move this back up here. So you can hear the in terms of the style, right? It's absolutely psychedelic rock. You have those blistering guitars, this voices coming in like a angry ghost asking for vengeance. And of course, the lyrics are talking about inequalities, the intense poverty of the southeast in Turkey, the lack of schools, the lack of resources, and this kind of plea for state resources to come to places like to come to Urfa or Maraş, etc. So it's really actually fascinating that you take this style that's associated with the hippie movement and with all these kind of weird subcultures in places like whether it's England or the US or whatever else, and then the lyrics are talking about poverty in Turkey's southeast. So this combination of forces is really interesting because you have something that's considered apolitical, a genre like psychedelic rock, used to make this incredibly political lyrics that are asking all sorts of questions about inequalities in the country. So Selda Bağcan made İnce İnce famous, but of course the song is a cover, like a lot of Anatolian rock songs were. And it's actually a song by Aşık Mahzuni Şerif, a musician. Oh, one second. Yeah, it's a song by Aşık Mahzuni Sherif, who was a musician from Kahramanmaraş, who grew up in a poor village with no water or electricity that was dominated by a rich lord. So Mahzuni first recorded the song in 1967, and then in the mid-70s, Selda did her cover. But one thing that's interesting is, you have the exact same lyrics, the music is different, but what it means from these different people's mouths. In the case of Aşık Mahzuni, it's a lived reality of poverty. Coming from Selda, it's this moment of political awakening where urban, relatively educated young people like her were suddenly waking up to this question of what is happening in the countryside, what is happening in the rest of Turkey. And they had this strong desire to both go down there and also to communicate the ills of the peasantry. So it's this interesting moment of politicization and sort of discovery of what's happening in the kind of, dark side of the moon almost of one's own nation. I was thinking about this thing that Nurdan Gürbilek, the cultural scholar, talks about. In the 80s, she says, you have Turkish intellectuals discovering the third world inside their own country, especially with, becoming awoken to the Kurdish problem and everything that's happening in terms of, ethnic and linguistic inequalities and oppression, etc. But I think in the 60s too, there's sort of this discovering of the third world within one's own country that happens in this period. And I think it's really interesting to see that process. And it really inspires the music. So here's a short quote, actually quite a long quote, from Oya Baydar, who you know both as an intellectual. She was a Communist Party member for a long time, and a novelist, talking about in the 60s. And maybe I won't read the whole thing, but she talks about how these young idealist teaching assistants mostly would leave Istanbul or Ankara, travel down to the countryside, and do research into the social structure of Anatolia. So they would get on buses and they would go to the cotton fields of Suke and Çukurova, the coastal villages of the Black Sea, hazelnut farms, tobacco fields, etc., and trying to discover what's going on and having this really incredibly excited process of discovery as well. So what's really interesting is you have intellectuals going down and also student activists going down, trying to make links with the peasantry, which is becoming really politicized in this period. At the same time, you have these musicians, these basically Turkish hippies, going down to the countryside as well. And you have, for example, Fikret Kızılok here going to meet Aşık Veysel and sitting at his feet, almost saying, Master, teach me how you do this. Very different from the attitude I showed you at the beginning. With Bağlama, who would listen to that? We listen to Elvis, right? There's an incredible transformation in the space of a few years in terms of how this stuff is done. And it's very much part of this political process of discovering, quote unquote, the third world in one's own country. And this is really interesting, of course, because this idea of the peasant is a really important one from the beginning of the Republic, with this important, this famous slogan of the peasant is the master of the nation. But of course, people who study policies towards the countryside and the peasantry in the early republic show that, as much as the official rhetoric heroized the peasantry, really the goal was to keep peasants on the land, to keep the social structure from, changing too much and really trying to stop actually internal migration, which of course starts to happen in a really intense way. So this idea of both populism, halkçılık, and also köylülük, peasantism, are part of official ideology, but actually, as scholars will talk about, don't work in the welfare of, the peasant class for the most part. What's interesting is that just the same way that student activists would take different aspects of Kemalist rhetoric, for example, the students being the dynamic forces of society, that, if the leaders suddenly turn wrong in this kind of Jacobin way, as Emin Alper argues, can hold the leaders to account. Similarly, also this legacy of peasantism, even if in practice it didn't actually lead to, welfare for peasantries or, land reform in different ways, it becomes a sort of ideological fulcrum for these young activists and rockers to say we're actually being really patriotic and going down there and trying to start the peasant revolution. It's also really interesting that in this moment where the Turkish peasant is almost becoming an obsolete figure as more and more peasants are moving to the countryside. And by the early 80s, for the first time, the population of Turkey becomes majority urban. So just as the peasant is sort of disappearing as a figure, and these young people are either meeting peasants as their neighbor, seeing them in their neighborhoods or in gecekondu's, or actually going down to the countryside to see the ones who remain on the land, it's this moment where it's really huge in the public imagination, this figure of the peasant. So there's a really kind of interesting background of how these things are happening. Okay. Let me skip ahead and talk to you about another really important political song to show you how much the music of Anatolian rock overlapped with the left-wing politics of the period. So a really important figure here, of course, is Cem Karaca, who kind of took it the farthest you could take it in a lot of ways. And for that reason, lived in exile for a long time after the coup in 1980. Let me show you the last song I want to show you today. Really quite a fascinating one, which won't be obvious to you at first, maybe why it's so political, but you will soon see. Yeah, I'm testing my technological skills. Okay. And it's quite a long song, so, oh, you know what? Actually, I'm going to put the lyrics up as we listen to it. I'm going to skip ahead because the first part's beautiful, but quite long.
Canım hey, kalktı geceyle biraz kalktı geceyle biraz şalelleri arar giden eller bizimdi. Aramaklar yakın eder kınalı. Aramaklar yakın eder kınalı. Yüce dağlar aşan yollar, yollar bizimdi. Yollar bizimdi. Yollar bizimdi. Yollar bizimdi.
A really fascinating song. I recommend listening to the whole thing. But as you might have guessed from the name, if you have heard of Anadolu, of course, he's a 19th century folk poet and warrior from a nomadic Turkoman tribe in Anatolia. And this folk song describes a real historical event of the attempt of the Ottoman Sultan to forcibly settle the Afşaroğulları tribes. So a common strategy in this period for securing central authority in the countryside was forced resettlement, but the nomads will often fight against this forced resettlement. So this folk poem, in the kind of typical syllabic meter of folk poetry in this period, describes the tribe's armed struggle to protect their mountains and stay on their lands. So the arrangement is really, I think, beautiful and interesting, and really, really powerful. Let me go back a second. Yeah. So it became actually one of the big hits when this song came out. And in 1971, the influential fan magazines of the period, like Hey and Ses, which are things I look at as part of my research, were scoring this a #1 song. So on the surface, it seems like an obscure event from the late Ottoman Empire. But just like we saw with Uşak Tarlası, you can take this kind of seemingly innocent historical or anonymous events and re-politicize them the way Ruhi Su talked about. And of course, in this period, like again with Yaşar Kemal, you have these kind of figures of the folk hero fighting against the power that's very much present in this song. So if we think about this context, Karen Barki, the historian, says that in mid-20th century, radicals like Yaşar Kemal and the other writers studied the exploitation of the peasantry and discussed social banditry as a type of peasant rebellion. So what Cem Karaca did with the song is re-signify this historical rebellion against Ottoman authority as possible inspiration for the peasants of the present in the 1970s. So when the song threatens to revolt, it's not against the Ottoman state or the Padishah, it's actually, talking about the Turkish state in this period. So this is really interesting too, because of course in the 1960s globally, this figure of the guerrilla, the rural guerrilla, Che Guevara, for example, in the mountains of the Sierra Maestra, in Cuba, for example, or the practice of guerrilla warfare by Mao's Red Army encircling the city from the countryside. All these things are, of course, being discussed in Turkey, just like they're being discussed other places. Maoism, of course, was an important force in the 60s and 70s in Turkey. You can see some of these books on either urban warfare or Focus strategy, as Che's strategy was called, of these small roving guerrilla bands. So in this context, it's very kind of wink to take a song like this about rebellion in the late Ottoman Empire, because even if you're not saying a single word about the present, the subtext is very much there. And very interestingly, in 1971, when these three men, Deniz Gezmiş, Yusuf Aslan, and Hüseyin İnan, three student activists who, of course, went to the mountains themselves thinking they could start the revolution in Turkey from the countryside like Che did. And of course, they were actually informed on by peasants in the countryside and eventually arrested and hanged. The day the announcement went out on the radio that they had been hanged, the song Dadaloğlu came on the radio right afterward. And this really kind of interesting historical coincidence. And when, for example, you have Cem Karaca saying, many a brave man will fall to the ground, the dying will die, but the living are ours. Again, that wink, wink there is happening, where the context is talking about these young people and their heroic but doomed struggle in this period. So despite how radical a lot of these musicians would get in the 70s, they often came under fire from the left, from more militant aspects of the left, who would say that these musicians were imperialist stooges. Why? Because they played the guitar and they used this style of rock and roll, of course, associated with American mass culture. So it's really interesting to see how this stuff goes. They're very much, want to be part of the left. They see themselves as expressing these ideals, but are constantly rejected. So Selda Bağcan, for example, gives this example of playing a show, a benefit for DISC, the Revolutionary Trade Union organization. And a group of Maoist students come up to her and start booing her, saying that the guitar is an imperialist instrument. You should be playing the bağlama instead. And you could see how this pressure changes her aesthetic from her album in 1976, where she's wearing blue jeans and playing the guitar, to 1979, where she has shalvar and bağlama, right? So this kind of process of discovering ourselves as Anatolian rockers would talk about it, and going back to our roots, kind of became more and more radical, to the point where this boundary between self and other that really got combined in the music of Anadolu Rock, where you have, psychedelic rock style, but lyrics and melodies from Turkey, gets harder and harder to hold on to as the pressure to turn back to oneself and one's own culture gets stronger and stronger. So that kind of wonderful ambiguity of the music sort of becomes unstable, and the left, more and more becomes almost chauvinistic in its desire to only have what is us and reject anything that comes out of it. There's an anti-imperialist politics there, but there's also a kind of nationalism really, really present in that whole ideology as well. So I think it's interesting to see that tension and how it sort of breaks down. Okay, so let's see. I have about 10 minutes. I think I can finish it. Are we okay for 10 more minutes? Okay. All right. So talking about the rock and roll as an imperialist genre is worth thinking about. So what is rock and roll and where did it start? So scholars of rock talk about it as being this genre that came out of multiple decontextualizations and theft and reinterpretations. So one great example, of course, is people talk about how Elvis stole his song Hound Dog from the Black musician Big Mama Thornton. And of course, we know that rock and roll drew heavily on traditions of Black music and often did steal them without giving the credit that's due. But in the case of Hound Dog, for example, actually the case is really different, because you have two Jewish New Yorkers, Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, who actually wrote Hound Dog for Big Mama Thornton. And then from them, Elvis steals it and makes his own. So you can see all these kind of moments of theft and reappropriation and sort of putting different masks and characters on. Or the example at the bottom here, you have this really important surf rock song. Sort of becomes the beginnings of surf rock, Mısırlı, which of course comes from the Turkish Mısırlı. But the Greek adaptation of that word, meaning a female Mısırlı or Egyptian, performed by the Rebetiko musician Detos Dimitriades, and then taken up by Dick Dale, right, who was of course I believe part Lebanese, right? And then it inspires surf rock groups like the Shadows, who then inspire groups like Silhouetteler, who basically took the same name as the Shadows and Turkified it. But it's actually this Levantine folk song. So it comes from this process. It comes from the region and then goes through all these steps before coming back, right? So on the one hand, it's really complex when we think about what rock exactly is. We can't just call it an American genre, for example. It's more complex than that. But at the same time, this music is really becoming popular all over the world because of processes of American influence, soft power, this whole process that comes into being with the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, with Turkey joining NATO. Famously, when you talk to Anadolu Rock musicians, they'll tell you that the best way to get, a Dick Dale record or an Elvis record or whatever else, or to get a guitar was for American soldiers who were in bases in Turkey at the time. So this, not just soft power, but actually military might is a big important part of the story of the music coming to Turkey as well. So when Turkish leftists talked about rock as being an imperialist instrument, an imperialist genre, it's both yes and no. It's part of this story of the Cold War. It's also a really complex thing because wherever it went, it got transformed and taken up in new ways. So I think one issue with the way Anadolu Rock is sometimes discussed is it's a little bit too inward gazing. People tend not to always put it in its global context. But there's really great scholarship about global rock and roll. And one of my favorite is this book called Refried Elvis about the rock scene in Mexico in the 1960s. And what Eric Zilov says in this book is that rock provided a wedge for societies caught in the throes of rapid modernization. Rock was a wedge in the sense that it challenged traditional boundaries of propriety, gender relations, social hierarchies, and the very meanings of national identity in an era of heightened nationalism. So he's talking here about Mexico, of course, but I think you could say the same thing about rock in Turkey as well, navigating all these things, kids running out, growing their hair long and dancing in obscene ways, was playing with gender roles and playing with propriety in different ways, talking about one's own country and what it means to be influenced by the mass culture of other countries. All these things of negotiating nationalism are really present in this music. And I think it's really important to look at other examples where this is happening. So you have the Tropicalia movement in Brazil, a really interesting rock and roll movement that's doing similar stuff as Anadolu Rock. You have people like Dionysios Savvopoulos in Greece, who similarly will take melodies from the Greek countryside and do this really crazy rock and roll thing with it. Jethro Tull famously, if we talk to members of Molar, they tell you that they love Jethro Tull because they would go and find folk songs from the English countryside and then adapt them to their style of music. So this moment that, gets talked about in this very nationalist way of we're going back to our roots and discovering the pure folk music, and becoming ourselves again, that the Anadolu rockers would say, is actually happening simultaneously all over the world in this moment. So it very much is not separate from these global flows of music and politics and culture and everything else. In the US, you have the folk revival movement, people like Pete Seeger, early Bob Dylan, this idea that when you go to this folk music, you find something pure, this real expression of the people's genius. But just as in the case of Turkey, where these folk songs were collected and there were all these processes of millenniation, American folk music also, of course, is not just something that exists in the wild. People play music, but the idea of it, of course, is very much ideological in the end. And the same kind of chauvinism I talked about with the Maoists booing Saldabajan, of course, happened if you think about when Bob Dylan went electric. Famously at the Newport Music Festival. He took out the electric guitar for the first time and people booed him because they felt like it was a betrayal of this real sense of the people and what the cause was. So there is a conservatism to the folk revival as well that also isn't unique to Turkey. In Greece, there was a debate between Mikis Theodorakis on the one hand, who was closer to the kind of both to the Communist Party and this kind of more pure folk style, and then rockers who were doing something a little more wild. So actually the same debates at the same time are happening all over the world in this moment in really interesting ways. So yeah, they had good reasons to believe that rock was an imperialist genre, but of course the situation is a lot more complicated than that. And often the rhetoric of turning back to oneself has a romantic nationalism to it. And it could be a conservatism, as I'm trying to say. But the real great thing about Anadolu Rock is that it's not pure in any ways, right? You have this mass culture genre that's being imported all over the world. It's being taken and then meshed with Turkish folk music, which of course is also something that's recently invented. And then it's not like what can we call it? It's not a synthesis, because neither thing really is a stable category that you can really say exists, right? Both are invented things that get combined in this really wonderful way that I think has a lot to say about the conditions of how culture travels, how politics and different ideas travel in the period. So I want to draw here on my fellow art fellow, Perin Gürel, who has a really interesting book called The Limits of Westernization. And she says there that this idea of selective Westernization, that you can take the civilization but not the culture, right? That kind of thing, carries within it the seeds of transculturalization, which she defines as the extremely complex transmutations of cultures interacting in asymmetrical relations of power. Even the most resolute national rulers can have no say over how, or even whether, their reforms will take root and hybridize, like with Anadolu Rock, with local cultural formations. Moreover, since no cultural formation is ever entirely foreign, or fully local, we can only speak of cycles of hybridization and indigenization. So I think this is a really helpful way actually to think about Anadolu Rock, even though her context is different here. Because as I've been trying to show you, neither Turkish folk music or rock music are stable categories that we can take for granted. Both are invented, they have multiple origin points, different emissions, different additions. But I think some of the most powerful music of the 60s came out of this recognition that there's this kind of worlded self formed through popular culture and through nationalism, in which local and foreign, authentic and commercial cease to be things that you can really separate very clearly. So I think the thing that was most powerful about this music that has a real political kernel to it is that recognition of that complexity and the way all these things are both invented and also completely important. So I think I'll stop there, and thanks so much for listening. It's exactly 55 minutes. It's good.
Oh, this has been amazing. Thank you so much, Kenan. This
My
was a
pleasure.
very fascinating talk. A lot to, think about, a lot of food for thought. So now I think we can open up for questions. Any questions from the audience or over Zoom? I mean, feel free to type it up over the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can, unmute you. Just so let me see. Anyone in the room? Paul, maybe we can start with you.
So at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the global revival of this music. And as you know, in 2006, the Finders Keepers label issued the classic 1976 Selva Vajan album, and it sort of blew up and was embraced by people around the world who had never heard it. I got really into this record before I moved here for the first time in 2008. And so I was really into it, and I was asking friends here, like, oh, what do you think of this? And they're like, oh, that's like our parents' music. So I guess at the time it didn't seem like it was that cool, but just within a few years, like there was this revival in Turkey as well. Like we've had, with artists like Group Ses Beat doing like mashups of Selva tracks that are being played in like, the coolest clubs in Istanbul. So why do you think that revival occurred here in Turkey? Like, was that an inevitable process of the global revival, or are there more specific reasons for that revival here?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you're asking, in case people in Zoom couldn't hear, about why exactly this revival is happening these days. So yeah, it's interesting. I think really it's the fact that it was discovered by these, weirdo music collectors who are reissuing these albums because it sounds, weird and groovy to them without much, knowledge of the context it comes out of. I really think that rediscovery abroad made it cool again, and kind of reintroduced this young generation to it. And you have things like the YouTube channel, Anatolian Rock Revival Project, and you have, like you said, bands now making music like that. You have the Dutch-Turkish band Altıngun, who was nominated for a Grammy. It's really become this big thing. And I think it really is the fact that it became popular in Europe and North America that made people look at it again and be like, wow, something was really interesting happening here. Because it really was a genre. I didn't talk about the ends of it, but this experiment sort of disappears without a blip, and it's partly because of arabesque taking over, and it's partly because of the coup in 1980. But for example, there's this great anecdote that a music scholar gives of like a panel that was held in the early 1990s, I think, about whether it's possible to have rock with Turkish lyrics. Can you have such a thing as Turkish rock? As if this entire almost 2-decade experiment didn't happen, right? So it really was forgotten. But I really think, the interest is now partly is responding to that interest. But it's fascinating. I remember I went to a cafe in San Diego, and they were playing Selva Vajan song there. It's really become this huge thing, and that's why I think it's really important to look into what it really means in its context. I hope I answered your question. Thanks.
I was wondering about this the story that the song Dadaoğlu by Cem Karaca played in the radio TRT address after the execution of this kind of thing. And also, I was wondering if TRT was censoring any of these musicians at that time, essentially seeing down with this movement.
Yeah.
Can we repeat the question?
Oh yeah, of
for
course.
Zoom,
Yeah, of course. So the question was about the song Dadaoğlu playing on the radio. the night Gezmiş and his friends died and were killed. And then also, I just blanked.
And whether there was any censorship.
Oh yeah, censorship on
the
TRT. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know the exact details. It was hard for a song like the Anadolu to come on the radio, definitely. And there's really funny examples that these musicians give. For example, Moğollar were not allowed to put their songs on the radio because they would have different excuses, like saying it was détonné, like out of tune or things like that. But they didn't like it because it wasn't following the state archive in the way it was supposed to be done. But the Moğollar won a state music award in France. And after that happened, TRT put their songs on the radio that they previously rejected because now Europe was saying it was, something worthy of attention. But this is something these musicians really complain about. The TRT, for the most part, wouldn't play their music. There were a few exceptions, Dağlar by Barış Manço and songs like that, some really big ones. But they really had a lot to complain about with TRT and the way they would censor them. And in terms of explicitly political songs, like, İnce İnce, there's no way that could be played on the radio at the time. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. We know much about the reception of it at the time. Obviously it blew up, but did it blow up because it was popular among urban audiences, for example, or was it also popular among the rural audiences who inspired before it came?
It was both. So,
Again, sorry to.
oh yeah, of course. So the question was about whether it was its popularity both with urban audiences and rural audiences, right? Like how mainstream was it really? So one example I like from this is something Taner Öngör from Moğollar says, the bassist. He talks about how his band Moğollar would play at different gazinos in Istanbul or Izmir, etc. And they would share the same stage with Zeki Müren, for example. And you would have the soloists go up and perform, you would have this band and all their, long-haired fans would be out there being rowdy and say, down with imperialism and all this stuff. And, normally Zeki Müren would go on the stage last, but because the gazino would totally empty out after Moğollar played, one night he finally says that Moğollar should play last. So that's a level of popularity we're talking about. It was huge. And in terms of rural audiences, this is interesting too, and something I've asked these musicians about in my interviews. They would go to the countryside and people were playing a lot more shows in rural spaces than they do now. And the reason that was possible is because of outdoor cinemas. That infrastructure doesn't really exist anymore, but back in the 60s and 70s, even the smallest town would have an outdoor cinema where people go out and watch, the latest Yeşilçam movies or whatever, and they would double, of course, as concert venues. So these bands would go out to pretty small provincial towns, and people would first be curious. They would come in their van. They all have long hair. They've taken like different costumes from different parts of Anatolia and mixed them all together. Or like, it would say on the van Moğollar, they would be like, are you guys from Mongolia? What's going on? But they would really endear themselves because they were playing songs that these, rural people were familiar with in new ways, but it was music they could relate to. So they described the reception among rural audiences as being really quite positive. And then if you look at the chart data, for example, like those magazines, Hey and Ses, this music was, the mainstream thing there, or the fact that Hürriyet was putting this much attention into it. So very much, mainstream and listened to in both contexts.
There are two questions from the Zoom, so let me read them. So maybe we can then go back to the questions from the audience here. One of them is about, will there be a recording or even a Spotify playlist of this for the talk? We will have it on our YouTube channel, but for your playlist, maybe you can give a bit more information on that.
Yeah, actually, I made a playlist for art, but it was for the students. Maybe I can make that public. I'll talk to you about that because it was for art anyways, and I could share that with people perhaps.
That's wonderful. And then another question that has been waiting is about the women's role. Let me tell. Okay. Oops, sorry. Oops. Could you deepen on women's role? I mean, what were their challenges in this rock industry in Turkey?
Yeah, it's a really important question because there were very few women who were rockers. And part of this is just the sexism of the genre and the music industry in general. Of course, it's important for me that the first song that really made this all happen was by Tülay German. And it's not only a woman making the song's about gender oppression, really. It's about her being harassed sexually, the song seems to imply, and the way women's labor was not valued in rural society. So I think that's really interesting. Selda Bajan, of course, was important. Beyond that, there's this interesting thing with rock that ends up being often a really kind of sexist way of thinking about things, where rock is seen as more authentic and real, whereas pop music is often feminized, as different scholars talked about, and seen as less serious for that reason. One thing in the book that I didn't get into here is that I'm actually going to talk about pop artists as well, and then the way they were influenced by this genre. So you have people like Humeira, who of course is really important, especially early albums with more kind of acoustic guitar arrangements. The theater performer, Ayla Algan, I think it was, also was doing stuff on the stage with folk songs and adapting it in really interesting ways. So you have to look at pop too, to see whether women are involved in this movement, but that's a really important part of it. And also, I really want to look at exactly why those exclusions were happening and what it means ideologically, because in sort of scholarship on rock in Europe and North America as well, the topic of sexism is something that's discussed a lot, and it's very similar actually.
Okay, and one more question from Zoom. You mentioned that Cem Karaca, for example, had appeal for nationalists, but beyond this, was there a version of music that appealed explicitly to right-wing activists in these years?
Yes. So it's not Cem Karaca. Barış Manço was liked by ülkücüler, the people who support, in the MHP, especially the youth, even though he himself was always tried to stay above politics as much as he could. Like I mentioned, Ersan was liked by and was known to be closer to the nationalist movement. But in terms of songs that were actively political in a right-wing way, the same way Cem Karaca was, for example, there aren't many examples of that. The most is a kind of like Ottomanism in some of the music that has a kind of militarism thing to it, but with older and not explicit themes. So some Barış Manço songs have that kind of Ottomanism to it, Ersan as well, but those are the main examples of how that happens.
Any other questions from the room here? And how about our participants on Zoom? Are there any questions left? There is one. Please, Greg, please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this talk. It was really, really wonderful. And you mentioned that you also had things to say about, say pop music, and I'm really curious about that, especially the development of, maybe the arrangement genre throughout the 60s and 70s, which, in some cases seems to be kind of in opposition to Anatolian rock. Especially, İlham Gencer, who recorded the first arrangement, was a nationalist. He was the cultural advisor to Alparslan Turkish, and his friend Fedri Ebcioğlu, who was a prominent lyricist, and then you had like Ajda Pekkan started out with them, but then she sort of ditched Fedri Ebcioğlu for Fikret Şeneş. So it seemingly kind of a feminist turn, maybe. So I'd really be interested in what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. That's really interesting. I mean, the politics of who the songwriters are, especially in pop music, where it's more often the case that you're working with a professional songwriter, I think is really interesting. And you're right to point out there are the same kind of polarization is happening there as in the politics of the left and right at that time. I think the turn that Ajda Pekkan did is a really interesting one, and people have written about this actually in interesting ways. But songs like Sana Ne Kime Ne have these kind of pop feminism, this sort of populist feminism, in different ways it can be interpreted like that. I think it's really interesting to look at, and the collaborations she had and other important women songwriters were active in the period as well. Al-Rajman is interesting. I do see it as in opposition, and this is what actually Anadolu rockers would say themselves, that this was an empty genre, and it was just like copying the same songs popular elsewhere, like Parrots. So this is kind of triumphalist narrative of moving past arrangement that I think is worth looking at the kind of ideological aspect of that as well. So I hope I answered your question, but your comments are very helpful. So thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else?
Well, maybe I can ask the final
Sure.
question. It's just, so when are we expecting the book? I know this is like probably the one that should never
First question,
ask.
yeah.
The first question ever, but just since this is part of your book manuscript, we're just wondering when to expect it.
Yeah, that's a fair question. Like I said, I'm still doing my field research at the moment, but trying to write at the same time. I'm hoping the manuscript will be done maybe by the fall. And then at that point, I'll keep revising it and send it to publishers. What I'm trying to do right now is actually make sure my first 2 sample chapters are in good shape and sending it to publishers. So I'm thinking about who I got approached by one publisher already who's interested, but I'm trying to think about what the best thing might be, the best home for the book. But yeah, hopefully the manuscript will be done and maybe it'll come out, who knows, 2024. That's probably the soonest possible.
Yeah.
But I do have an article published that talks about this stuff if people want to see anything written in the Turkish Historical Journal, I believe it's called. There's a special issue in the 60s. So if people want to hold themselves over with something.
Real, right?
From
Turkish
Brill.
Circle Review.
Yeah, Turkish Historical Review, yeah.
It's, I think, available open access.
It is, I believe, yeah.
Okay.
So people can check that out if they're curious. Yeah.
Maybe we can give it a link.
Sure.
Just under your video on YouTube.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And I'm
that'd be
also
great.
going to do a podcast. I've had a podcast project in mind, giving a history of Anatolian rock, with each episode being a different song and going into the history of that song and what it means. So hopefully that'll happen also maybe in the fall.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kenan, and thank you all for joining us, both in person and over on Zoom. And also we would like to thank, of course, Anamet for hosting us and Murat Türk for his excellent technical assistance here. And we wish you all a happy new year and we hope to see you in 2023. Good night.